All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's really awesome to see so many people. Also, some people that I know from previously working at Blip. So it's really great to be here. As you can see, if you recognize any of these, you might know what I'm going to talk about. You may know that I maintain a library for Storybook, React Native Storybook. And that's essentially the topic of this talk today. And what I'd like to cover is something a bit like how I got started, where it's at right now, and what's the next steps. What am I planning to do next with it? How can people get involved? And basically that kind of stuff. Yeah, let me move on. So this is me. I'm Daniel Williams, or Danny, and there you can see my Twitter handle. If you feel obliged, you can add me, and you can see my work on GitHub as well. I work at Callstack. Callstack is a developer agency for React Native. And so if you're having trouble with React Native, they're the experts you can go to. Yeah, that's it. And here's a little bit more about me. If you can see in the picture, this is React Native Universe. I just had to throw that in there. Um, so yeah, I worked at Blip back in 2020. And at the time, we were just starting to put React Native into the Betfair app. I was part of a team called All Blacks. Some of the people are here. And yeah, I maintain React Native Storybook, and I've been living here in Porto the last 7 years. And yeah, I am half Brazilian, half English, so I do speak Portuguese. So feel free to speak to me in whichever language. So next, this is kind of the overview. I kind of already mentioned we're going to talk about the future of React Native, but also where it's at right now and how it got there. So for those of you who don't know what Storybook is, I'll try to give a little bit of introduction. I'm going to assume that you guys have a bit of a understanding about what's React Native, what is Storybook to some degree. If you don't, then you'll find out a little bit now, and hopefully it will make more sense as I go through. So as you can see, it's basically like your workspace for creating your design system, your dev toolkit. It comes with some things out of the box to help you develop and really like build out your app. So it's not your app, it's sort of sets outside of it or to one side. And it's a little bit different between web and React Native. So in the web, this screenshot you can see is actually an example of a storybook by Adobe. And Adobe has like their own design system that's publicly available to look at. So you can find this. Storybook has a showcase page where you can see a bunch of example storybooks. And here, I'm going to explain a bit what some of these things are in the next slide. But yeah, basically you can get from Storybook a certain amount of documentation, testing, and there's a sort of workflow that we advocate for, which is component-driven development, where when you get a screen or something, you break it down into little pieces and you say, okay, let me develop each of these and all their states individually. And then when later on, I bring them together and you can make stories of your components and sort of combined components. And there's this whole idea of like atoms and molecules, which I won't get too much into. And I'm going to try and go a little bit fast here so I can get to the demo. And yeah, if the demo gods smile on me, then it can go well. So yeah, and you can also use it to share your design system. So if you have designers or QAs, you can send them the app and they'll be able to look through all the components. And then if you're trying to match a design, you can compare them there. And so here you can see a bit of an example of what a story is. Don't worry too much if you're not familiar with the syntax. It's just to get an idea. You have some sort of metadata that you tell it, okay, this is the component, maybe some details about it. And all of this here is kind of just for TypeScript, so that you can get some auto-completion and stuff like that. And then you see the args, that's kind of what we use to pass props to your component. So the idea is that you would create your story will infer the props of your component from TypeScript, if you're using TypeScript, which you should be really. And once when you come here to the args, you'll be able to autocomplete, see all your props, and you can put in default values. And then in Storybook itself, you can control those. And I'll show you what that means. It might seem kind of abstract right now, but yeah, overall, yeah, you can have multiple stories per component and they sort of show below each component as states, different versions of that component, how they might behave in different scenarios. So you might have like a disabled state or an error state, for example. And when you click between them, you'll see what they look like. So here you can see a little bit what I'm talking about. This isn't interactive, but there will be, I'll show a demo later where I can show some of this stuff. But basically you can see in the middle, there's the components, and in the bottom there is the controls, where you control those arguments, which get passed to the props of the component. So if you're using React, you just kind of think of args as props, and it's the same thing, basically, just a way of mapping. And then you can see there's like 3 components in this storybook. It's just the example one. You have the button, the header, and the page, and they each have sub-menu items there, which are the stories. And you also have the docs, and that's that thing I talked about just earlier, which is it generates some documentation for you based on types and whatever extra information you add in there. And so I'm going to now shift back into React Native Storybook and what's different there, and what I'm here really to talk about, which is React Native Storybook. And React Native Storybook is pretty similar, but also very different in some ways. So it doesn't just work out of the box on React Native. Like the Storybook that we know, or you may know, is built for the web, right? And they thought of it from the beginning was more about like, okay, let's see our design systems on the web. Although there was an early version of React Native, but besides the point. And basically what React Native does is it takes some of those internal APIs from Storybook, puts them together in some way, and then we build another UI for Storybook, but for React Native. So we just rebuild all the UI, and that becomes the React Native Storybook. And the idea is we sort of replicate the main functionality of the web Storybook, and you're able to kind of reuse the same code between web and React Native. So if you're familiar with React Native, it does work on the web, and React Native Storybook also works on the web. So it works on the web, it works on Mac OS, it works everywhere that React Native works, it can work. How well it's supported on Mac OS is another question that we'll get into. And yeah, basically that's it. And here's a little bit about how I got started. Don't try to read that whole thing, that's just illustrative. It's a bit about what I mentioned earlier. I was actually here at Blip when I got aware of React Native Storybook, and we were trying to replicate the web Storybook for the mobile web version of the Betfair app. And it was just kind of in a weird state. Wasn't actively maintained for some amount of time. And there was a bunch of issues. And basically it was just after like, okay, how do we get past this? How do we actually move fastest and develop our app? We don't want to spend time like on this like separate problem, right? And yeah, it all ended up with me sort of messaging all these people on Twitter and GitHub, and eventually I made this discussion and just said like, hey guys, I don't know what's going on, like can someone like help me figure this out? And they essentially just said, well, why don't you just do it? And that's how I got started. So that's how it works with open source. If you ask too many questions, you become a maintainer. So there's a warning for you. Yeah, that was the main sort of introduction. So sorry if I went a little bit fast, but the idea is to get to the good bit. And this is something that might look a little bit weird, but if you know anything about like the history of React Native Storybook, it's gone through a couple different like evolutions. And this is about like the earliest screenshot I could find. It's actually in a video that's like 9 years old on YouTube. And it's the very like early versions. And I don't know if you can actually read that there, which you don't have to, but it actually says Kadira React Native Storybook. And Kadira was the original creators of Storybook, but the company eventually like folded and the project came in like a weird state. It's gone through a lot of these kind of evolutions, and eventually was picked up by a guy called Norbert, who basically took it to a good place, and now it's maintained by a company called Chromatic. So that aside, this is what React Native Storybook used to look like. And if you're wondering what you're seeing, like, yeah, it's pretty weird and confusing. On here, this is the mobile device, of course, right? And it's actually displaying a story, which is the Hello World default view. And in this version of Storybook, it was only possible to preview the component on the device and control it from a web view. So you were completely, like, your control of Storybook was separate from the app. And that's a functionality that does still exist, but we'll get into that more in the next slides, basically. And then here's a little view of how it's then changed since then. So there was like an early version there that had like a tabs thing. And then there was another version of it, which actually was a nice improvement that a community member contributed. And I sort of collaborated with that guy, and it came out pretty nice. And what I really didn't like about the first version is that the preview became incredibly small whenever you try to look at anything. Like, I'm trying to change the story and I can't even see what I'm looking at, right? So what we try to get to is a place where you can see the components and your controls, and you can change story and still see something on the screen. So that's a little bit about how this UI has evolved. But if you are familiar with Storybook, you might notice that actually it's very similar to what Storybook looks like on the web. And actually, but the original UI was also based on the web version of the UI, and we've kind of just tried to follow in their footsteps the whole time. And they really overhauled the design in like version 8. And I also then had to kind of overhaul the design in newer versions as well of a React Native Storybook. So that's a little bit of the visual version of what happened. And here I've got like a screenshot here of a post that I did a long time ago. Now you probably can't see it, but it says 2023. And this was like 3 years after I first started getting involved. So you can see it was like, and we went from like 5.3. So it was like one major version essentially. And that was a big milestone for me because it was really difficult initially to figure out what was going on. I'm working in my free time, trying to figure out, okay, how do I do anything here? And yeah, over time, managed to figure it out. I got a lot of help from the core team on Storybook, and we ended up in a good place, I think. And so during that time, I basically just rewrote like 90% of the code, and we revamped the UI, and in collaboration with the web team, we figured out a way to reuse a lot more code, implement the newer syntax for stories. So if you know about Storybook back in the day, there was a different syntax, which is called stories of, and so everything changed in like version 5, version 6. So this is why this was a really difficult release to get to. And so this is just a little overview as well. Of course, I have to show it just to feel good. But basically, over time, the growth is there. You know, I started back in 2020 on the project, and you can't really see it, but at the very beginning, there's like 70K downloads a month. And now we're at over 1 million, you know, growing. There's a little blip there, but it was Christmas, so I put it off to that. But yeah, that's just to get an idea. Like, the project is growing, it's getting better, and trying to improve it all the time. So, and now we're gonna get to some good stuff, right? So what's next? And basically, first step is get up to date with all the web stuff. And that's always the goal. It's kind of like a never ending battle because they have a whole team and I'm one guy. So I have to like run after everything they're doing. And if you look here, there's a couple of things that are kind of, I've put in here. So there's this thing here. It might look a bit foreign, but that's a new syntax actually for stories that's in a preview right now. And it's called CSF Factories, or they're kind of calling it CSF Next in some materials. And the idea is that it becomes completely type safe and you don't have to annotate anything anymore. And so that's something that we're going to work towards as well for React Native. There's some stuff to figure out, but it's kind of working already, and that will be hopefully working by version 11. And so right now we're on version 10, and version 11 will be maybe in a couple months, 3 months, not sure. Don't quote me. Yeah, and then just like generally reducing the bloat, making Storybook lean is going to be a big goal, and we're going to try to get on more platforms and support them better. That's kind of like a me goal. Like, I want to see it on macOS. And actually in this image, you can see that it does already work, but it's a little bit scuffed. which you won't see, but if you try to use it, you'll see what's happening. And yeah, some testing and tooling around like AI, around whatever. Everyone's using AI right now, so I'm experimenting with things like skills and MCP servers to see like what we can do. And Storybook web team is already working a lot with MCP server. It's really, I think, in preview right now, and it's really interesting. They're posting a lot about it as well, so you'll be able to find out more about that pretty soon. And yeah, here's again the macOS Storybook. You can see it does kind of work. I think this is a video. Yeah, there you go. So it's working, and if you were just building a macOS app, you could totally do it and use Storybook to build out a design system. And this is also pretty interesting. This is a TV. So this is another thing I did in collaboration with Amazon for their Vega OS. And yeah, it's basically you can run Storybook on TV now. So if you're making apps for TV, which is actually a bigger market than you might realize, then you can use Storybook now. Yeah, and I want to come back to that testing and dev tooling thing. So basically, I have been working a lot recently, like very recently, on a couple of like cool tools that I want to play with, and I want to get out there as well for people to improve the development experience. If you remember back at a bit earlier on in the slides, I showed that original version of Storybook where you're controlling it from a web UI. Now, a lot of people actually really like that way of controlling Storybook remotely from another place where the UI is like easier to access the story directly. Like you don't have to hit the bottom sheet and all this stuff. And it's been a kind of a battle to make the UI like really simple and like usable without like having those problems of like how do you navigate it like fluidly. And actually a lot of those things can be solved by kind of going back to where we started, which is using some kind of separate UI, right? And we actually still support that old flow, but now with a lot more sort of to it. So under the hood of Storybook, there's a thing called channels, and the channel in Storybook is basically a WebSocket, and it's just a fancy name for it. And the WebSocket in React Native Storybook, we have a way of setting it up when you create your when you put your config setup for Metro, you can start up the WebSocket server automatically for you. And recently also added a REST server there, so you can basically tell Storybook to do what you want it to do from whichever tool you want. You can drive testing tools with it. You can, and I'm going to get into this pretty soon, but you can do things like use a React Native DevTools plugin. So I've just made this one here, and I'm going to show it to you a little bit in a minute, which is a Rosinite plugin. So you may have noticed there's a call stack thing on all my slides and everywhere. Rosinite is a tool built by one of the call stack engineers, Simon, who's like a really smart guy, and he's just shipping nonstop this year. And basically, I added a plugin with that tool, Rosinite, and it gives you the ability to control your Storybook in that old way, the same way that you used to with the server. And in this way, like when you're developing, you can much easier to just go through, and it not only changes one story on one device, it changes the story for all the devices that are connected. And if you change on the device, it goes to all the other devices and to the DevTools UI. So it's like a full sync between everything. And at the end here, you'll see that something about like streaming devices. And this is something that is kind of experimental. And I'm going to try and show it first because I set it up to make sure it was going to work. And if it could just go wrong at any moment. So this is a video in case it fails, but I'm going to try and demo this for you, and we'll see how it goes. So on my screen here, you'll see a web storybook actually. And this is another tool that I developed, which is the React Native Web framework for React Native, for Storybook, sorry. So the React Native Web framework lets you run like React Native Web with Vite in a web storybook. So I didn't want to get too much into it because it's like a lot of different concepts, but just this is the full-on web storybook, and these are React Native Web components. So I'm using the same components for React Native and for web, right? And if I just click through here, you'll see that there's just a couple. This is just the basic thing you get when you spin up a storybook. But what's interesting about this storybook is that if I bring up, for example, this device, and maybe I can like resize the window here. If I just navigate here, you'll see that they're both updating at the same time. So let's say I'm looking at both web and iOS at the same time. I want to make sure that I'm making the UI match in all places. I can do that. And I can also look at Android. But what's even kind of a little bit annoying is that I have to keep switching between everything, right? You saw that. So if I just, put these conveniently placed buttons here for messing with the UI, if I just, maybe I got to move this sidebar a little bit. How do I hide this thing? There we go. There we go. So now what you can see is it's actually showing me all the different versions of the component in one view. If I bring the sidebar back up, they're all updating in the same view in the web, right? And this is like this interesting idea that actually Salman, the same guy who's making Rosenite, sort of approached me with, and I thought that was pretty interesting, and we made a little prototype pretty quickly. And so now if I show you something that I think is pretty interesting, if I just mess with the device here, you can see this is actually a real device streaming to the browser. So it's not like I'm just faking it with viewports. It's a real streaming of the actual device. So you get like kind of the full experience, right? And that's kind of the idea. This is like pretty experimental. I haven't developed this out as like a easily usable add-on or something yet, but that's the goal. And so hopefully, that looks interesting to you. And, maybe someone, if anyone is interested, you can come up to me and tell me what you think about it. Give me some of your thoughts. But yeah, you can kind of see like, one thing I didn't show is actually, it also works if you change the controls. So I can update the story and just have it like change the button color, for example, and it's all updating live. So this is all because of those channels that I spoke about. It's a WebSocket connection that they're all connected to. And, like I said, it's even interesting that you can update it from any of the devices, update the controls from any device, and it will all sort of sync up. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to show for this demo. And we'll see if this comes to your like npm packages anytime soon. Don't look at the red arrows. That's not important. But yeah, this basically works through a tool called Appium, which hasn't always been my favorite tool, but it actually has a lot of like interesting features that I didn't even know existed. So yeah, let's go back to the slides, but technically we don't even really need to do that because the next thing is a demo. So demo number 2 is that just another sort of interesting idea that I've been working on. So firstly, I'll show you a bit more about like how you might want to use Storybook, right? So if I just start up my Storybook, just give me one moment. Let me just check everything's set up. Yeah, cool. So I'm gonna run Storybook here. And in this case, I'm gonna start with just the iOS simulator. And I'm gonna restart this because it will be, yeah, there we go. So just bear with me. I have to switch apps. So here you can see a different app, a different Storybook, and this one has a couple more things. And like full disclosure, this is completely generated. I didn't write any of this. If you see your name, that was Claude. And I don't know how it figured out some people's names, but maybe you just have a really common name. Looking at you, João. Basically, yeah, you can see here a couple of things. Basically, here's the UI. This is how you change stories. I have here a mixture of screens and some like individual components, right? So this is that idea of kind of bringing those things together, the little atoms and the molecules, and just showing this in case, so you see what I'm talking about. And the other thing I can show is just if I stop this and just say like button start, I also have this. Let's see if it will work. Of course, it's not going to work. And if I just reload it, you'll see that I have actually an Expo router app. And all I did was change the command. So this is something that I worked on a while ago, but it's basically you can just switch an environment variable and have it like switch between modes. So you go between your app and your Storybook. So in here, this is just like a fun demo app of like React Native Porto app that we might make or something. Probably we won't do that, but just a fun idea. And I will just quickly show the other thing that I wanted to show because I know that I'm running out of time here. I knew this would happen. Okay, so now I'll show them my design system, and I'm gonna bring up my DevTools. And so if you're familiar with DevTools, you'll usually see this kind of stuff here, right? The console, whatever. And now you've got an extra tab, which is Storybook. And if you set up the WebSockets stuff, which is getting easier, by the way, I have a release coming out soon that will make it really easy, just automatically connect. When you connect there, it grabs the stories from the server. And now I can change the stories remotely from the DevTools. And then from here, like I can go really quick, I can search, whatever, maybe I go to my event card. And yeah, like this is the idea to simplify the development process or basically give you more options of how to control your Storybook instead of having to manually go through. And one thing you can do with React Native Storybook is you can hide the UI and then you can just use it like as if there was no Storybook UI. And you can even hide it here in the configuration. So if you don't want the UI at all, you just set this to false like that. And then you get rid of that other button. But of course now, I'm not going to mess with it because that would ruin my demo. And yeah, that's essentially the demo. But I guess one more thing I can just show is if I bring it up on the Android device, you'll see it does the same thing as the streaming demo, which is that you can control both at the same time.
Tick tack, tick tack.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, look, there's João Silva. It had him. So yeah, I'll just show that and then I'll kind of finish. So you can see it's swapped at the same time. So that's the idea. Some dev tooling that's going to come out. The next plan is to make a VS Code extension, and that will kind of do the same thing and give you a bunch of different options, be right in your developer environment. And then maybe we do an MCP server, who knows? All kind of possibilities are there because we have this WebSocket available. And now I guess I'll just finish off by saying, let me know if you have any bug reports, if you have ideas, if you like the ideas that I showed off, just reach out to me. You can reach out on X or wherever. And thank you very much, everyone.
Time for one question.
Oh, yeah. Okay. We can do questions, I guess.
And
I thought we didn't have time. Oh, okay. Cool.
And then if you have more questions, we will do some networking there. So you?
Yeah. Hey, Dan.
Hey.
I actually have a bug report, but that's for later. What is a bit heavier? I can clearly see the value proposition of building like the entire pages on Storybook as well. This is something that I never tested before. I only built design systems there. But my question is, how would that work regarding the state that you carry on the pages? I mean, usually in my designs, my pages have hooks that control a lot of different moving parts, so I can render different stuff and control the subtree of elements. How does this work once I'm building the pages on Storybook, considering my pages will include the hooks as well?
Yeah, so I mean, this is something that's a little bit of a difficult topic because with React Native, mocking is a little bit complex, but it's totally doable if you know how to mess with Metro. And I do know how to mess with Metro, but to make it work for everyone is kind of more difficult to come up with like a reusable way. But what I would say is that to your best ability, you want to like extract as much as possible out if you can and make it in sort of a reusable way. You can almost have like a screen where you just pass down the stuff from above, but that's not really what you want to do, right? It's not ideal setup. Another thing is like if something like Expo router is getting in your way, maybe, we need to work on some like integrations and stuff. But you can see it was running in Expo Router right there. So a lot of the Expo Router stuff will be fine, especially if you're running it inside of an Expo Router, like as a screen, which is how I was running in that demo. But yeah, I think like with that stuff, a lot of it will come down to you can use like mocking data requests with like MSW, for example, and that should get you some of the way. The other stuff when it comes to like screen state and params, that's not, I don't have like a concrete answer on that, but I expect that you could kind of create a mocked version of these things, and then you can use a decorator, which is what we use to sort of wrap components in stories, and then you can provide like example data down through a decorator. But doing that with Expo Router isn't as straightforward as I might like, but you know, I have Evan's Twitter, or maybe I'll message him and he can help me out. But yeah, hopefully that will be a more like easier process in the future. It's definitely something we want to do, as long with like testing and all this other stuff. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem.
Last more question.
Yeah.
Last more question. So we have a lot of animated components with reanimated. How does it work? Like probably you figured out that already because this library is huge.
Yeah, there's everything that works in your app will work in Storybook because it lives inside your app. So you don't have to configure anything special. Like maybe if you want to like, you could even like configure the animation like spring and stuff with some sort of toggle, you know, like it should all work.
Okay.
Any component should work.
Cool. Thanks.
Bet.